Can't hear anything.
We can't hear you.
People are having problems.
We haven't got any sound. We haven't got the sound working.
Is that the sound? Is that, can people hear us now? Yes, you should be able to hear us now.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely no problem.
Okay, well, sorry about that, folks. It's the we had a tripped over lead. Okay, sorry about that, Chris. We're in business.
That's a glass of wine.
Just say when, John. Okay, right. So moving on. Oh, we've got a technical problem now. This is not working.
Oh, cool. It's the last go of the Yeah, now we're moving on now. Try forward and back.
Right. Yep, excellent.
That's it.
Lovely. Right. Sir Barnes Wallis was born in in Ripley in Derbyshire, the son of Dr. Charles Wallis, a general practitioner who trained in London, and his mother, Edith. He had an elder brother and two younger sisters. After about 4 years living in Ripley, the family moved back to London, to the New Cross area. Dr. Wallis contracted poliomyelitis and ended up in a wheelchair. So it was very difficult for him to practice. So they had a moderate living in southeast London. Nevertheless, they were determined that both sons and daughters, if possible, would have a good education. The elder son got a scholarship to Christ Hospital, which was in the East End of London at that time. And Barnes Wallis, in due course, managed to get a scholarship as well. This is a picture of Christ Hospital building in East London, and also of Barnes Wallis in the standard uniform. While he was there, the school moved to Horsham in Sussex. He was quite a good pupil, but not outstanding, although he won form prizes for physics and German in particular. He was pretty average, and when it came to the age of 16, he determined that he wanted to, he was particularly interested in sciences, and he was encouraged in that by two masters, Professor Henry Armstrong and, as he called him, Uncle Charles, the science master at Christ Hospital. So having enjoyed science and won the science prize, he determined he wanted to be an engineer. Unfortunately, Christ Hospital School didn't cater for sort of sciences in sixth form. So he had to leave, and in fact, he left before his matriculation. And in fact, the school wouldn't even allow him to sit it. His father seemed to fall out with the headmaster. And so he left with no qualifications at all. First thing he did with his father, who, as I say, was in a wheelchair, a tricycle wheelchair, was tour all the engineering works in southeast London. And eventually he got an apprenticeship with the Thames Engineering Company on 4 shillings a week, working on marine engines mainly. There was a bit of a recession at that time, and the company diversified into working on a prototype taxis and also racing cars. So that's where he started his apprenticeship. He transferred his apprenticeship to John Samuel White on the Isle of Wight. This is a company of shipbuilders that built corvettes and destroyers for the Royal Navy, and he was working basically in the drawing office. I'm going to talk about somebody else, but somebody who had a major impact on the future career of Barnes Wallis. This is Hartley Blythe Pratt, and he has an interesting background, if you'll just excuse me diverging a bit. He worked up at Vickers at Barrow and Furness, Walney Island. And Vickers were building an airship, the first airship, His Majesty's Naval Airship #1. This airship was, the keel was laid down in 1909, and it was planned to fly it in 1911. It became known as the Mayfly because all of the contracts, the keel and the launch date were all in May. And when it did finally emerge, this is the dock, Clarence Dock at Barrow and Furness. That's about as high as it got off the surface of the water. The Navy, as the Navy does and the Air Force does, started specifying extra equipment, which all added weight. And basically, His Majesty's Naval Airship had no surplus lift left. So it went back into the shed, which by a complex system of pulleys. It's a floating shed on the side of the dock. And this airship was about 500,000 cubic feet. At that time, Hartley Blythe Pratt was working in stress calculations, and he calculated and forecast that when it came out, because what they were doing, they're going to add a center section to the airship, put another airbag in to increase the lift. He forecast that when it came out and there was a strong wind, a gust of wind, it would probably break its back. And sure enough, August 1911, after the center section had been added, that was the result. And it was towed back. So Mayfly became no fly, and it was back to the drawing board. In fact, it never re-emerged. It was scrapped. So H.B. Pratt in 1912, the Vickers knew that war was coming, the World War I, and they tried to contract all their engineers to long contracts, minimum of 5 years. And Pratt wasn't happy at doing that. So he left Vickers and managed to get an appointment at John Samuel White and joined Barnes Wallis in the drawing office. And in fact, they shared accommodation. They went sailing together and became great friends. 1913, this is a Zeppelin, the latest Zeppelin that was launched from Friedrichshafen and set off for Metz in Alsace-Lorraine, which was in German hands at that time. And unfortunately, they flew overnight and they got lost and realized that when dawn came up that they were over France, and they thought, well, the best thing, rather than cause a diplomatic incident, we better land and apologize. Unfortunately, they chose the polo ground or the fields outside a French cavalry regiment. And the French officers invited all the crew in for lunch and drinks. And while they were drinking and eating, all the engineering staff from Paris came up on the train, took photographs, measured, and even invited the British naval attaché up as well. So we had a complete set of plans and photographs of the latest German Zeppelin in 1913. The Germans were very keen and were leaders in Zeppelin airship design, and they ordered 12 more Zeppelins for the German Navy. And this spurred the British government into action. The British government, the Admiralty, or who was Prime Minister, whether airships were in favour or not. But they decided we needed to get back into the airship business. And they appointed, well, first of all, they wanted somebody in charge of the project. And the managing director of Vickers said, I know the guy, that young Hartley Pratt, Blythe Pratt, he seems to know what he's talking about. And somebody had to explain to him, in fact, he left the company. But they managed to persuade him back, and he went to London, become the chief designer. And after a few weeks, he invited Barnes Wallis to join him as his chief assistant. So they worked out at an office near Victoria Station with a cover name of Mountains, just a counter-espionage move. During the war, well, first of all, on the outbreak of war, first thing Barnes Wallis did was go and sign up, very first day. Came back to the office, said to Hartley Blythe Pratt, I've taken the King's shilling and I'm leaving tomorrow. The Hartley Blythe Pratt informed the managing director of Vickers, who got hold of the First Lord of the Admiralty, and the following day, Wallis was out of the Navy and back in working for Vickers. And during the war, he saw in and out of uniform, either working as a civilian, which worked better than actually working as a military officer. And this is the first airship they produced, very similar to a Zeppelin. His Majesty's Airship number 9, gondolas below, engine pods, same long cylindrical body. And then there was another series of airships, the R-23, R-26 series, built by Vickers, Beardmore, and Armstrong Whitworth. But the first, as I said, they're all basically based on that Zeppelin design from 1913. Wallis thought he could do better than Pratt, and this is the first really big improvement in airship design. Still got the control ship cabin below and the engines external, but a ellipsoid shape which was significantly less drag and about 40% more efficient than the Zeppelin design. That only flew between, and then of course this didn't happen until 1920 by the time this flew, and it only flew for a few months, but it proved the efficiency of the design and Wallis's talent. Now, about this time, he met a young lady. In fact, sadly, his mother had died a few years before, and his father had remarried. And Molly Bloxham was the niece of his stepmother. The only thing was, Molly Bloxham was 17, and by now Barnes Wallis was 34. So this didn't go too well with Mr. Bloxham. And he only allowed them to meet with parental companionship, or she went away to university and they were allowed to communicate, but not to express any personal feelings in their letters. This series of letters at university, and in fact, nearly all of Wallis's letters to his mother and to Molly have been preserved and very much form the basis of this biography, which has just been published by Richard Morris. Thousands and thousands of letters. In this letter, she's having trouble with mathematics at university, and Wallis developed a method of sort of online teaching or correspondence teaching, and these love letters are all about how to do calculus. But we're now in the early 1920s. In this chap, Commander Denniston Burney. Burney was an aristocrat, wealthy man, who became even wealthier with his invention of the paravane for cutting tethered mines during the First World War. The royalties from that added handsomely to his wealth. And this is a motor car that he designed. I think only about 8 of them were built. And in fact, they were actually built up in Howden near Hull. The rear engine, quite advanced for its time, but I think only 8 of them were actually built. But he had a vision for airships, and Wallis shared that vision for him. And this is another letter where I'll just quote from it. He said, there is in my way not the least doubt that in 2 or 3 years from now, we shall have the most wonderful series of airliners running from England and India twice every week in 2.5 days, carrying 200 passengers each. Mails, I read that as emails first, mail and parcels. And this was a letter that Wallis wrote to Molly Bloxham after he'd gone to the Zeppelin factory with Denniston Burney to investigate developing airships. Burney managed to persuade the government to go ahead with an airship scheme, and they developed a scheme where basically 2 airships would be built, one by private capital and one by the government. And they became known as the capitalist airship and the socialist airship. R100 was to be built by a subsidiary of Vickers, and R101 was to be built at the Royal Airship factory at Cardington in Bedfordshire. But basically about 730 feet long and 140 feet in diameter. 5 million cubic feet of highly inflammable hydrogen. They needed somewhere to build it, and the only building suitable, this was a one-off contract to Vickers, and they didn't obviously want to build a new factory, particularly of the size that would be needed for this. So they managed to find this old airship hangar at Howden near Hull, say where the car was built. It was far from suitable in many ways. It was rusty, it leaked, it was cold and miserable, but it was the right size. They could build with about 2 or 3 feet spare either side and top, and a couple of feet spare at the end. Just to give you an idea of the size, at the top is a model of the R100, and at the bottom there, a 747. So absolutely massive. This is unlike the Zeppelins, which had cabins hanging below. In this case, the accommodation was going to be internal on 3 floors. The mid-floor was a dining area and cabins and promenade decks. Upper deck was cabins, and the lower deck was for the crew and the engineering works and the galley. In plan view, it would take up about 100 passengers in 2 and 4 berth cabins, and very basically furnished with the lightest of material to save weight. Electric galley run by a generator off one of the diesel engines. And that was a shot of the dining room, which accommodate 50 people at a time, so the meals would have to be done in 2 sittings. This is a shot on the promenade deck. There is a publicity film taken at the time, and it's interesting that these potential passengers are sat in the middle of 5 million cubic feet of hydrogen, and all the men are smoking.
Oh,
I think the film was probably a pre-flight thing, but it didn't all go well. Right, the actual manufacture of the structure for the R100 was made up of these triangular girders, which had three long tubes, section this size. This is actually a bit of the R100 that was saved. And those three tubes were joined together with cross members. There were only actually 11 parts to the airframe. There were 11 parts designs. Some were different sizes. So in all, there were 51 different parts that made up this airframe. To produce this tube, Wallis designed a machine, which you see here, which would take rolls of duralumin in on the right, and they'd be riveted here. You can see you'll see how it's riveted there, and that could produce up to a 70-foot length, and it was only limited really by the length of the rolls that could be supplied. The structure was built, had 16 transverse sections and 16 longitudinal sections. So you can see the commonality of all the components. A lot of the people who worked on it were ex-riggers from the fishing fleet. And that is a spider joint, which is at Yorkshire Air Museum. And that was for joining the transverse and longitudinal sections together. This is the front airbag. I'll mention this a bit later when we get onto geodetics. Now, this person you probably all know is Neville Shute. Shute was his middle name. Norway is his actual name. He joined Barnes Wallis at Howden as the chief calculator, and he did and his team did all the stress calculations. It was while he was living in York and in Howden that he started writing his novels. In fact, Wallis only flew, I think, on a couple of the flights of the R100, but Shute flew on most of them. Oh, must be 10 years ago now, I was asked at short notice by the Lower Nidderdale Women's Institute, could I give a talk, because the lady booked that evening had died. So I thought, well, I must find some interest for the ladies. And I found this little bit in Neville Shute's biography. It's called Slide Rule. And this is his description of the girls that worked in the factory. He said, we employed a large percentage of our labour in the form of local lads and girls straight off the farms as unskilled labour, training them to do simple riveting and mass production work. The lads were what one would expect, straight from the plough, but the girls were an eye-opener. They were brutish and uncouth, filthy in appearance and in habits. Things may have changed since then. I hope they have. Perhaps the girls in very isolated rural districts such as that had less opportunity than their brothers for getting into the market towns and making contact with civilization. I can only record the fact that these girls straight off the farms were the lowest types that I've ever seen in England, and incredibly foul-mouthed. We very soon found that we had to employ a welfare worker to look after them because promiscuous intercourse was going on merrily in every dark corner. And we picked a middle-aged local woman thinking that she would know how to deal with problems that we had not contemplated when we started to build an airship. But the experiment was not a success. I forget how we solved the problem. Probably we never did, because as the job approached completion, the need for unskilled female labour was reduced and we were able to get off to get rid of the most juggly types. I discovered two of the ladies in the audience were farmers' daughters from the Howden area. Yeah, in fact, they did. You see from some of the photographs that they did all the sort of sub-assembly work on the girders, and in fact, because the hangar was so damp, they had to paint all the girders, which added another ton of weight, which is a ton of, you know, carrying capacity lost. So that's Neville Chute. This is before it's due to be launched. At this time, the man from the Air Ministry, who was based at Howden, had a panic. He wondered whether the contract was for Vickers to build and deliver, or just to build the airship. So whose problem was it getting out? And it turned out it was actually Vickers' problem. They contracted to build and deliver. So it was sometime, it was probably almost ready at the end of September when this photograph was taken. But it wasn't till mid-November that Wallis and his wife, Molly, were staying in the Cairn Hotel in Harrogate when she heard that they were going back to launch the R100 the next day. And she sent this postcard to her friend saying that they were off for the launch tomorrow morning. It took about a regiment of soldiers to walk the airship out of the hangar, so it didn't, I say it only had a couple of feet either side and above, and it was slowly walked out on a very subdued November morning. This is one of the test flights, and you'll notice, you probably see, how do I get the pointer? That got it along the side, a bit of a ripple in the skin. And the man from the Air Ministry thought, design fault. And he looked at knocking money off the contract price. But Barnes Wallis pointed out to him this only happened when it exceeded the specified maximum speed by 10 knots. He said, you know, if you like, I'll put a detent on the throttles. But so it was accepted at the contract price. That's a back. On the left there is a small aircraft. Give you an impression of the size. I've got a little bit of, it's a long film, which I'll cut very short, which shows you it's taking off. One of the requirements of the contract was to demonstrate a transatlantic flight. In fact, they flew the R100 across the Atlantic to Montreal, and they toured several Canadian cities and Niagara Falls. Took them about 3 days, just over 3 days to fly out, and coming back with a tailwind, it was just about 4 hours over 2 days. This is the R101. It's actually flown earlier than R100, but like the Mayfly airship in World War I, it didn't have enough lifting capacity. So it went back into Cardington to have another section put in the middle. There's a lot of pressure on the airship factory to get it ready for Lord Thomson, the Minister for Air, to fly to India for a Commonwealth conference. And after it came out of the shed, it had absolute minimal amount of testing, and certainly not, it wasn't tested in strong winds, strong gusty winds. And it set off on the date demanded by Lord Thomson. And as you know, over northern France, it got into difficulties, probably a rip up here caused the front airbag to collapse, and it porpoised down until it hit the ground, and the electric cables ignited the hydrogen, And that was a result. Very few survivors, a mass funeral near Bedford afterwards, and basically the end of the British airship industry for a long time. Now we'll try this. John, can I ask you? Or I'll try.
Let's try. See if it works.
I'm not getting. Yeah,
See.
that it takes a
Takes
while,
a second.
but
That's it.
I'm not getting the. What I'm trying to get is the sort of timeline at the
Yeah.
bottom.
We can move this other bar out. That's it.
This is actually Barnes Wallis speaking, obviously added many years later. It's taken originally on 16mm black and white film, converted to VHS and then digitized. So the quality is not that good.
Should start now.
Okay.
That's it.
It's too long. This what I want to jump us towards the end. That's the tube machine.
Let's follow. Okay.
Normally I get. a
I know
timeline.
you should
Yeah.
normally. Let's see if I can get the bar up for you. Okay, we can start.
Airships passenger carrying ships. In those days,
See if we can move it on.
fuel could not be obtained
Hmm.
inside sufficiently to make the girders
Sorry, folks.
Yeah.
of an airship capable of carrying 100 passengers. So I had to invent my own fuel breaking machine. And the longest
That's the farm girls assembling.
was 74 feet long. That length
No,
to
we'll skip to the next one. Yeah.
the manufacturers
I did want to show it's about 20 minutes long and it's a bit monotonous. So unfortunately, we missed the end where it shows you flying over York. Right, I mentioned about the gas bags. Obviously, what you needed to do is maximize the size of the gas bag to fit inside the airframe without rubbing. And to do this, Wallis studied geodesics, which is basically the shortest line on a curved surface. And that was the start of, so he was able to maximize the gas bag. That then led him on to think about how can I use this in aircraft design. And on the left there, you see the conventional design of an airframe at that time. And on the right, his use of geodesics, which would give you all the inside of the airframe for space, for equipment, but also a lot of redundancy in the structure, the strength of the structure. Wallis, while the R100 trials were going on, had actually moved from Howden down to Brooklyn, down to Weybridge, and was working on aircraft design. And this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit. This is the first aircraft built with geodetic design for the fuselage and wings. The Wallis, single engine Wallis, very ugly aeroplane, but it actually held the world's long distance flight for many years. 3 of them flew from Ismailia in Egypt to Darwin in Australia, non-stop. Obviously had extra fuel tanks built in 42 hours. And that record stood for a long time. But the major development was the Vickers Wellington. 20 odd different variants of the Wellington were produced. over 11,500. It was in production at the beginning of the war, was still in production and squadron use at the end of the war. In parallel, this shows you some of the female workers, again, assembling Wellington, I think at the factory at Squiresgate in Blackpool. And that's an example of a Wellington that managed to get back, obviously, a lot of damage, but enough integrity in the structure to get back and land safely. So in parallel with was a slightly bigger version, the Warwick, the Vickers Warwick, and this ended up actually being used mainly for air sea rescue missions. It carried rafts and equipment, safety equipment in the bomb bay, and there's 750 of these were built, more than the actual number of short Sunderlands, which people seem to remember more. And let's go back. There was another Vickers aircraft, a 4-engined version called the Windsor, and basically that was going quite well in design, but the Air Ministry decided that with the Halifax and Lancaster in full production, they didn't require another aircraft that didn't offer much, more in performance. We're into World War II now, and Wallis had read the Air Ministry, targets, potential targets, and one of them was the Ruhr dams. And his idea was for a 10-ton bomb dropped from 40,000 feet, which would penetrate the earth on the water side of the dam and cause an earthquake effect. Problem with that, there wasn't an aircraft capable of carrying a bomb of that size. It did come up with a 6-engined aircraft called the Victory Bomber, but again, there was no money forthcoming from the ministry to progress that. So he then developed the bouncing bomb and the dams raid, which I said I wouldn't mention, but just we'll skip that. That is the result of the attack on the Mona Dam. In parallel with the development of Upkeep, the bouncing bomb, was a smaller bouncing bomb called Highball. And this was very much supported by the Royal Navy. And they were looking for using it against capital ships, particularly the Tirpitz. And this would bounce like Upkeep across the surface, hit the side of the battleship, which was very heavily armored there. But the backspin would cause it to tumble down underneath the ship and explode below the hull at its weakest point. 618 Squadron Mosquitoes was formed, based at Squadron in Scotland, and it never actually was used. It was held back because they were worried once they used a weapon like this that the Germans would develop something similar. They would copy, and of course they did get a complete Upkeep bomb from the dams raid. So they never actually used Highball, which Mosquitoes could have carried too. They did fly the squadron out to the Far East with plans to attack the Japanese battleships, but that came to nothing, and the weapons were all destroyed in Australia. That's a Mosquito doing a test drop of a Highball. Progressing towards Wallis's 10-ton bomb was the Tall Boy of 10,000 pound weight, medium capacity bomb. The casings were forged in various steelworks, particularly Sheffield and Cumbria. It took about a week initially to machine one of the casings, so the initial production rate was very low, but it turned out to be a very successful weapon. To increase the accuracy of the bomb, they fitted an offset tail, so it caused the bomb to spin. So a bit like the rifle in a rifle for a bullet, it increased the stability of the weapon. And it was used successfully against U-boat pens, E-boat pens, but particularly against the Surmar Tunnel just after D-Day, attacked by 617 Squadron. And they put several bombs into the tunnel entrance, and this was just a bit further up, which completely destroyed the tunnel and prevented German panzer reinforcements moving up to Normandy. So it was quite a significant effect. This was the battleship called the Beast by Churchill. It was the #1 target for the Royal Navy and the Air Force, because it was basically lurking in Norwegian fjords. It was tying up a lot of the home fleet, which was really could be better employed further afield, and particularly in the Far East. So it really was a priority target, and there were many, many attacks. U-boat, what they call them, two-man torpedoes, attacks from aircraft carriers, none of them really successful. And it's quite a long story, but finally it was destroyed in November 1944 by 617 Squadron, which was followed by 9 Squadron. 617 Squadron using a more accurate bomb sight and causing 3 hits on the Tirpitz before it rolled over. The Navy said it didn't sink because it was still showing above water. So it was only counted as a capsize, but nevertheless, it was out for the rest of the war. And then finally, the 10-ton bomb, the Grand Slam, again, produced around here. This was used in particular against the Bielefeld Viaduct. Bielefeld Viaduct carried the canal across Germany, which supplied much of its war supplies to the front. And you could see how many times it had been attacked, the bombs, and the 2 large craters here and here. And that was dropped by Squadron Leader Calder of 617 Squadron, knocked down 10 or 11 archers and put that out of action for the rest of the war. The end of the war, BE Day, Wallis notes in his diary supersonic flight, and he develops 2 projects, the Wild Goose concept and the Swallow concept. This is the Wild Goose, basically about the size of one of the Red Arrow aircraft, the Hawk. And you notice there's no tailplane, there's no ailerons on it, no ailerons. It worked by differential wing sweep. So to turn right, you would sweep the left wing forward and the right wing back. So it'd start rolling to the right. To climb, we pull, the wings would come back. To dive, we go forward and alter the center of gravity. And these were tested, and I'll show you a film shortly, down in Cornwall. This is Swallow, which is based, again, it's a swing wing aircraft. The forward part here is basically a delta, and then swept wings. Its first design was for a 56-seat passengers in first class, and then a double bubble fuselage for tourist class with 200 seats. This is a model. Whoops. I think they would have had great engineering problems with the mounts for these engines, which would have to turn as the wings swept. That's a model of an interceptor for the RAF. And now, hopefully, a flight. The first bit is about the wild goose, and the second bit is a development flight of a scale model using the swallow principle. Barnes Wallis was very much affected by the loss of the aircrew, in particular on the Dams raid. Oh, battery's running low, John.
We switch it on.
While we're
I'll sort it out.
again, you'll hear the voice of Sir Barnes Wallis, which was added sometime after. Yeah.
Click on it. We'll just click on it. Should start it.
There we are.
These are flying an entirely new type of aircraft. Instead of having the wings near the bow, they are put at the stern, and there are no controls whatever, no rudder, no elevators, no ailerons. The only thing the pilot can do is move the wings backwards and forwards about a vertical pivot, which in this case is placed inside the fuselage. The first models were driven by a hydrogen peroxide motor and launched off a railway carriage specially designed, which could get up to a speed of about 100 miles an hour in a length of about 400 yards. Here she goes. There's a typical takeoff, which is entirely automatic once the lift on the airplane equals rather more than the weight. We found that the way to do this without endangering the life of a pilot by making a manned aircraft was to have two pilots, one on the beam who controlled the height. He could only move the wings backwards or forwards, and another one on the end of the runway, whom we will see in a moment, who can only move the wings one forward and one aft, depending on which way he wants to turn. We call this method of controlling the aircraft twist and steer. Here's the height pilot, and here is the aircraft landing on an old runway in a very strong crosswind, as you can see. The roll control pilot is out at the end of the runway towards which the airplane is approaching, on a tower about 40 feet high, so far away from the runway that there is no danger of his being hit. The smoke that you see coming out of the tail is due to the hot tar. There's the roll control pilot. He has such difficulty in seeing the airplane when it's 3 or 4 miles away that he works through binoculars. And here is a typical takeoff taken from a safety pit underneath the launching railway. Now he's going to turn her around and he's working his roll control, which advances the right-hand wing and retracts the left-hand wing. The airplane rolls and turns. And now he's bringing her in to land. There's the center line of the runway. He's about half a mile away. While the height pilot, who is out here on the right-hand side, brings her down. The two pilots are in constant telephonic communication, so that each knows what the other is doing. And by that method, we were able to develop this aircraft at a minimal cost and at no risk whatever to life. This is the height control pilot, and that's his very clear control column. Here's another takeoff. There's the railway, and the camera this time is mounted inside the fuselage. That's the skid which pulls her up when she lands on the top. Over in the distance is the English Channel. It's interesting to watch the play of sunlight on the braking skid. I'm often reminded when I see this picture of a story of the late Professor Einstein, who was staying in England for a time and taking a train from London to Oxford, suddenly leant forward to the passenger sitting opposite to him, quite unknown, and said, "Do you mind telling me what time Oxford stops at this train?" You will of course remember that Einstein was a great professor of relativity. And here you have a stationary aircraft, apparently, with a world which is dodging up and down underneath you. Here we come round to the landing strip, and the roll control pilot is bringing her in. You see his tower right at the end there, just for a few seconds. There. Of course, we crashed about half a dozen of these aircraft. They were quite large, about 30-foot span, made up of a welded steel tubular framework inside, covered with balsa wood. Out of this type, I wasn't getting quite the high aerodynamic efficiency that I wanted in order to develop very long ranges. So I decided to turn the fuselage into a small Delta aircraft and put the wings at each corner of the base. In order to see how this would work, we made a little wind tunnel and put the pilot with his head in a perfect dome. The whole wind tunnel is mounted on bearings so that it can be tilted by an attendant standing by, and electric signals pass up this tiny cord to work the controls of the wings. Here is the pilot, only the one pilot this time, and he's now putting the aircraft in violent maneuvers. And when you think that that wind tunnel is only about 4 feet high, that the model is 2'6" span, and he's throwing her about and developing actually 2G, you will see how marvelously controllable she is. In the meantime, we made up a steel model in the supersonic position with the wings fully swept back. A thing they wouldn't allow me to do in England in case I lost control and killed somebody. The body of the model is filled with steady metering apparatus, which tells us what speed she is doing and the attitude and so on. And the Royal Aircraft Establishment kindly undertook to launch the model by means of a rocket, which falls away directly it is exhausted, leaving the model free to fly on under its own momentum. This first shot, there she goes, that's the thing to look at. That's only the corpse of the rocket. In this first shot, we got up to a Mach number of 2.45, whereas what we had designed for was 2.5 times the speed of sound. And in the second shot, we got up to the full 2.5 and had to blow the nose off the airplane in order to prevent her flying beyond the limits of the range on Salisbury Plain. There she goes, there's the bow, and without the bow on, the model rapidly becomes unstable. Having found from our wind tunnel experiments that the new type was going to be a success, we had sufficient confidence this time to make a full-size model that would stand, which took off on its own undercarriage. I didn't use the railway anymore. And here she is. You see, we've got rid of the great ugly thing that the fuselage type required, and we've got two dainty little fins at each end of the wing. This photograph shows the very first flight that was ever made with this new type. We call it the Swallow. With the wings stretched back, it's quite a beautiful machine, though in the forward position, it's not quite so elegant. But you will realize that the big aspect ratio, which we get with a large span of this type, gives us a very high lift coefficient, which means a low takeoff and a low landing speed. The work done by those two pilots is really very wonderful. That aircraft is being flown by messages transmitted by radio from the ground. And we found, to our dismay, that when flying over the English Channel, you often met patches of sea mist which were not perceptible from the land, and the pilots almost lost sight of the aircraft. Remember that these photographs were all taken by means of a telephoto lens, so that to the naked eye, that aircraft is practically invisible. And yet, those two boys were able to work their controls and bring her safely home. The knowledge that we gained from these tests enabled us subsequently to design an autopilot, which eliminated a lot of their difficulties. But here we are coming in to make the very first landing. Each pilot a little uncertain of the strength of his controls, and consequently the landing looks a bit jerky and a bit violent, although no damage was done. And it is this type which, in the supersonic form, was tested on Salisbury Plain by the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and gave us the full Mach number of 2.5.
But that was round about 1950. It wouldn't look out of date now, if it would it?
No.
So the early 50s, the country's pretty desperate for money. Not a lot of money available for research. So Wallis was sent by Vickers to the United States to try and sell his team to them to do research on advanced aerodynamics. He gave presentations, particularly about Swallow and Wild Goose, but came back empty-handed. Subsequently, the Americans produced the F-111, which to his point was a conventional symmetrical swing wing, no differential swing like his designs. just to cover a few of his other ventures. At the end of the war, he saw the need for testing aircraft under extreme conditions and came up with what was known as the stratospheric chamber. And this would enable components and bits of fuselage to be tested at up to 70,000 feet in terms of pressure or lack of pressure, and minus 50 odd degrees temperature. And this whole assembly was contracted to Vickers at Barrow because of their experience building submarines. And basically the sections were shipped down, I think, to Bristol and then transported by road to Weybridge, where it was assembled. And when it came to its end of its useful life in the mid-80s, it was so big, they decided to keep it and form it part of Brooklands Museum. It was refurbished probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. And here's a section, I think, of a 111 cockpit. It was also used, you probably remember, those of you who are old enough, there were a lot of trawlers lost in the Arctic and Barents Sea from icing, causing them to capsize. So Wallis did work in the stratospheric chamber, what this model is, to determine ways of reducing icing by different kinds of structure, using plastic rope rather than. I think it was 1965 when Ferrybridge cooling towers collapsed, and he did research into that. He also proposed cargo submarines to go under the North Pole, because our major customers were in the Far East then, and Australia and New Zealand, but they weren't really viable. Another project he was involved with was the design of the radio telescope at Parkes in New South Wales, using his knowledge for the structure of the parabola, although he actually fell out with them and refused to accept his fee. But the connection with, I used to talk from airships to spaceships. The connection with spaceships was that this telescope was used for the moon landing, receiving the signals from the actual moon landing. He retired in 1979. He'd been knighted the year before. Bomber Harris had promised him a knighthood in the war, but it wasn't until 1969 that he was actually knighted. He'd also become a fellow of the Royal Society, which he considered a much greater honour. This is his office, which is at the RAF Museum. He also has an office at, his old office at Weybridge at Brooklands is still existing, and the foundation have used it several times for trustees meetings. He did receive £10,000 for his war work, and he gave it all to Christ Hospital for an endowment fund for the scholarships for the children of RAF personnel. He became a governor and bursar at Christ Hospital and got involved in a redesign of the plumbing of Epsom College. He corresponded with Dr. Brown, his science teacher, but using Braille, because Dr. Brown had gone blind by then. He was also an accomplished wood carver, although I discovered he actually started these carvings off by putting Molly's, this is Molly, his wife, putting her head in a box and inserting probes at the side and measuring the distance, and then feeding it to a numerical control machine, and then doing the fine work. This is a first day cover, which commemorates the, I think, 40th anniversary of the first flight of the Wellington, the R100, flown by an F-111, but no mention of the dams raid. damage rate probably only took 3 to 5% of his working life. He died in 1979. He predicted that he would die at the age of 90. He suffered bad health on migraines, spent quite a lot of time in hospital. But he lasted the age of 92. And this is his gravestone in Effingham churchyard. If you want to read more about Barnes Wallis, I can plug these two books. The one on the left, just published only 2 weeks ago by Professor Richard Morris, author of biographies on Cheshire and Gibson. He's actually Professor Emeritus of archaeology, but he spent about 20 years researching Wallis's life, reading all the thousands of letters in the family archive. And from a technical point of view, that's very much about the man. From a technical point of view, I cannot recommend this book more highly by Ian Murray. Unfortunately, it's out of print and copies go for £70 to £100 at the moment. But this covers nearly all the technical details, inventions. Both cases, the biography, Richard Morris wanted to call it Barnes, Wallis, an Engineer's Life, and Ian Murray wanted to call it The Science of Sir Barnes Wallis, but the publishers insisted Dam Buster or Bouncing Bomb Man because it would sell more books. That brings me to the conclusion. I appreciate I've overrun a little bit, but are there any?
What a wonderful, interesting talk that was. Thank you, Chris. Any questions for Chris?
Good.
That's it. We've got one or two comments online. Well, there's a gentleman here. Okay.
You said you were from 617 Squadron. I hope you're not still radioactive.
Sorry?
I hope you're not still radioactive. What was the skin of the airships? Anyway, what was the skin?
The skin of the owl.
Yeah.
It was a fabric and doped and with a luminized paint to reflect solar energy. And because of the sections, it looks circular, but in fact it's 16 times.
We've got a question online. Jonathan, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? Jonathan?
Yes, it's more of a comment that surely the great figure in retrospect for the R101 was Hilda Lyon, who was Neville Shute Norway's assistant, as I recall. Can you hear me? And was Neville Shute Norway's assistant and went on to become a major aerodynamics expert, and her theories were adopted by the US Navy submarine designs.
Until September, yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Jonathan, the big speakers aren't working tonight. So
I'll type it and you can read it then.
Oh, you type it and I'll read it out.
Yeah. Any questions from the floor before Jonathan's doing that? Who paid for all the work on the Swallow and the Warships? Who paid for it?
Well,
Crickets.
yeah, they would have, some of it would be private venture and some would be government grant.
Right.
But I say, after the war, it was very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That must have been very expensive. Though.
Yeah.
Very expensive.
I started to say before the film, but he mentioned in the film that by using the ground-based pilots, there was no risk. And that was something he insisted on. He was very much affected by the deaths on the damage rate. And on the 30th anniversary, he was in tears. I didn't remember him.
You went to the
I did. I was on the squadron that night.
Do I remember there being some aircraft developed with a swing wing from normal sort of particular to the fuselage to be swept back, which was actually changed in flight.
Which was actually,
You know, from the wing being sort of straight across from the fuselage
yeah,
to being swept back, and that actually taken during flight.
the tornado is partially swept and then basically fully swept is almost a delta.
Yeah, yeah.
And then for low speed and landing, it's almost a bit like the swallow, it's almost
Traditional.
but like I think about 23 degrees. And there's quite a lot. It was actually spring wing design invented by the Germans in the Second World War. So, you know, so it wasn't a new idea, but his idea was the differential swing. How to get rid of the complexity of the controls, which pilots often got sort of cross-coupled.
I've moved it over here so that people can hear me when I read it. We've got various comments and questions, and I'll take you through them. Richard Udin, interesting that BW had a flyer's wings over the loop on his cuffs. My grandfather was an Royal Naval pilot that had a similar badge until 1980 when he was drafted into the RAF. One from Mary Mills. Thames Engineering is, of course, actually Pens, taken over by Thames Ironworks and run into the ground by Arnold Hills. They did make some interesting cars and coaches, though. One from Dan Hayton. On the summer Newcomen visit to the Ruhr, we visited the dam. One of our party members was engineer in charge of it after the VE day. From Roger Fairley, just a thanks. Stephen Broadhead, Barnes Wallis was very sceptical of Concorde. Was this justified? He seems to think that his design was superior.
He certainly held a grudge about Concorde and thought it was terribly expensive. Go back to the first question, the coupling.
Yeah.
He actually flew, if you remember, during the war and while he was at Vickers at Barrow, he was part of the time in naval uniform, and he did fly what do you call them? Sort of the balloons, power balloons. Blimps. Yeah. And in fact, it recalls one night almost crashing into the furnaces at the steelworks.
Okay, what have we got down here? From Jonathan Ailing, surely the other key person at the R100 was Hilda Lyon, who was the assistant to Neville Shute Norway and went on to become a leading aerodynamicist in the 30s, and whose ideas were adopted by the US Navy. She was a local girl to Howden.
Must look her up.
I think Market Wheaton.
Right.
I think there's a plaque for her in Market
Yeah.
Wheaton. From Dan, Fred Starr's Newcomen lecture Concorde on engineering failure can be found on the Society's YouTube channel. And I think, and one from Vaughan. And a comment from Vaughan Pomeroy. I remember meeting Barnes Wallis when my group of undergraduate apprentices had the opportunity in 1970. He described to us his latest plans for a hypersonic flight, Mark V, also carbon fiber. We had an interesting discussion about negative coefficients of expansion for carbon. He was also very disparaging of the Tornado, then MRCA, which he felt was carrying around unnecessary weight in a large fin and tailplane. From a few short meetings, it much easier than a legend had. If anybody else has got anything else online, please put them through.
Any question from the floor? Did you notice how his handwriting changed from the first letter to the second letter that he showed me? In the first letter, his handwriting was vertical.
Right.
On the second letter, his handwriting went sloping to the right.
And I read something about that. Not about him, but like
Oh, do I did that? Must be some psychological.
thousands of lessons. He wrote certainly every week, if not twice a week, to his mother when he was at school, and virtually every day to Molly
Yes.
boxing.
Mm.
And I say initially, it had to be strictly online tutorials. But never was he allowed to express any personal feelings.
On the subject of handwriting, slowly to the left, I can remember when my son was about 6 years old, that's obviously 26 years ago. He used to write straight up and down. And for some reason or other, I heard maybe through the teaching profession or whatever, that the conventional wisdom should be handwriting sloping to the left. At that time, my wife disagreed with me and said, let him get on with it, let him do as he likes. And from that date, his handwriting hasn't been very good at all.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, there's going to be something there, you know, on the net, but let's go in it. I just wonder whether perhaps he's ambidextrous. My father was ambidextrous, and he, with his right hand, was vertical, and with his left hand, it was straight. Is that right? So I don't know whether there's any interest in it.
Okay. Got a couple more online. Barnes Wallis seems to have made enemies. Sir William Penny threw him out of a meeting to discuss Britain's first atomic bomb, which he'd gate-crashed as a representative of Vickers. And from Peter C to everyone, if the courtship's so long, what ages did they marry?
I think she'd only just graduated, so she was about 20.
Yeah. So he was,
Yeah.
big age difference.
He'd be 37.
Yeah.
Did she die before Barnes Wallis died?
No.
Later.
Yeah. No, she was 70.
Because he was 92.
He was 92 when he died.
She was lucky.
Sure, yeah, she's mine.
Yeah, his family's still around, aren't they?
His family he had 4 children. Barnes Wallis Jr., Christopher, Mary Stewart's brother, who died a year or so ago, and Elizabeth, who is still surviving.
Right. Right.
She was on television.
Yeah.
Talking about Barnes Wallis, and I've told a number of people this, when I was a student at Manchester University UMIS, they built what they call the Barnes Wallis building there. And probably people that know UMIS will have seen that building. And Barnes Wallis came round to open the building, and I was working in the laboratory. And he came round with Professor Johnson, and he looked at me and said, "What are you doing there, young man?" And I explained it to him. And his comment was, well done, young man, well done, young man. And I walked off. But what surprised me was his white hair, absolutely white his hair was.
His inventions did help with the development of Concorde.
Yeah, I don't know.
So what?
They're saying his invention did help with the development of Concorde.
It probably did. There would be work he'd done that would be good. But it certainly was quite disparaging project. But then he was not the leaders of people to get on with them.
Did you say you've read that book all the way through, the new book? Yeah, it's worth a read.
It's really,
yeah.
I'd say Richard spent about 20 years researching it.
I bought a copy yesterday from Amazon. It arrived yesterday. Much to my wife tonight, probably another book. So I'm going to read it over the next week or so.
It's very much about him as a person, but it still covers a lot of the projects.
Yes. Yes.
But the other book gives you all the technical.
Yeah, I've got a copy of that. Yes. Okay. Is that it, John? Online?
Online, yeah, that seems to be. Unless anybody else, anything else online? Apologies for the technical problems at the beginning. Somebody's tripped over a lead, and we've broken one of the microphone extension lead. So, but we're back in business. We recovered from it.
We got there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we got
thank
there.
you.
Yeah.
You were able to thank
I wish I lived nearer so I could come to your talk.
I usually ask David to give a vote of thanks, and I just find it out, so thank you. Yeah, I can do.
Yeah.
I'll just. Anyway, Chris, I think on behalf of the newcomers.
Oh, that's why you were right.
Taking notes. That's your lecture then. Yeah, it's like Chinese. Like Chinese. Yeah, been a very, very lively question time. You've answered very, very thoroughly. It's obviously a reflection of your knowledge of Wallis's engineering achievements. Just one observation on Armac. The man must have been a workaholic to get through everything that